Alright, we should be live again, and I'm just going to make sure we are and just check on the old stream. So we were actually on time as well this time. Well, 1 minute late. Let's just see. Can we hear me? Yep, right, okay. So, welcome back. We've got two questions today that I'm going to talk about. I've got a number of sources ready in case we need to add extra information in. I'm going to try and allocate about half an hour per question. Unlike last time where I tried to allocate 20 minutes per question, which was a little bit too little amount of time. So instead of doing 3 questions, we're going to do 2. And we're going to spend longer on them so we can really get into the detail and analyse them in a lot more, detail. And the first one we're going to do is a judiciary related question, a Supreme Court, a court's separation of powers, a checks and balances kind of question as well. And this is, to what extent can judges check the power of the executive and the legislature? Okay, so like with every to what extent question, what we're going to be doing first is having a look at it's a balanced argument that we're trying to get. We're trying to get a for and against kind of thing going on. So let's have a look and just go through each of the parts of the question itself and see really what we're going to be looking at. I'm just going to close this down here as well. So it's a to what extent question. So we're looking for a kind of, if I can zoom in a bit more, so we're looking for a kind of for and against kind of debate that we're trying to build up. Okay, and we're talking about checks and balances, and we're talking about separation of power, and we're talking about with the legislature and the executive. And this is a UK politics, by the way. This is UK, not US. Although you could also apply this question to the US political system, and you probably have a lot more of an easier time just going through the Constitution and looking at checks and balances. So let's divide this up into 2 specific sections. Okay, we're going to have one section which is judges the ways in which judges do check power. Okay, so ways in which judges do check the power of the legislature and the executive. And then on the other hand, we're going to say ways in which they do not. So let's set a timer and start thinking about some points that we could utilise to see, what ways in which judges can check the power of the executive and the legislature, and ways in which they cannot. Let's start with ways in which they can. What kind of points does anybody want to chime in? Think, what kind of points do we can we come to here? Okay, and as always, if there's ever an article or something that if there's ever an article or something like, or a website page that I reference, I will link it in the chat box just so that we so everybody has access to them. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is judicial review. So let's talk about judicial review, and we'll write this down here. Oh, and someone's already come up with straight away with the power of judicial review. Exactly, the power of judicial review. So, in the UK, unlike in America, judicial review is a lot more powerful in America, because in America they don't have this principle of parliamentary sovereignty. But in the UK, judicial review is something that allows a High Court judge to examine the lawfulness of decisions that are made by public bodies. So the power, so we're just going to write it in shorthand. Okay, so the power of a judge to assess the lawfulness of an action by a public body. Now, when we talk about a public body, okay, and if a judge was to suggest that a public body acted ultra vires, okay, so if we use the term, if we use the term ultra vires, what do we mean? Okay, what does the term ultra vires mean when we're talking about the power of judicial review? Because these are the kind of key terms that you're going to need to examine. Okay. I'm just getting some points up as well in the meantime as well. Right. So if I say that if I was a judge and I was to suggest that a public body has done something and they had acted ultra vires, what does that suggest? What does that mean when it comes to judicial review? Exceeding power, exactly. So they have acted beyond their power. So acted beyond their power. Acted beyond their power. I've spelled it. Their power. There we go. Now, I want to start to talk about the kind of examples that we can look at when we're talking about powers of judicial review and the ways in which the Supreme Court and judges in general have checked the legislature and the executive in recent years. So what kind of examples can we look at? I've already got a couple that are lined up ready in case anybody doesn't have any answers. Oopsie daisy. There we go. So I have a couple of links already just in case. But I think this is a pretty easy question. It's a pretty easy question in general because, I mean, there are two specific cases that are incredibly high profile where you can talk about the way in which the judiciary has checked the power of the government. And I've already seen there we go, Boris Johnson and Gina Miller over Brexit. Exactly. So we could talk about the Miller cases. So let's come down here. So we could talk about the Miller cases. The Miller cases. Now there are two Miller cases. Okay, there's the first Miller case, which I believe was in 2017. Miller 1 2017, and this was with regard to the extent to which the government could trigger Article 50 and trigger Brexit processes without the power of Parliament, without parliamentary approval. So Miller 1, okay. So Miller 1 related to the power of the power of the government, okay, to trigger Article 50. As we know, Article 50 is the article that it sets in place the mechanisms for leaving the European Union. Power of the government to trigger Article 50 without Parliament, without parliamentary approval, without parliamentary approval. Now, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, I believe, the Supreme Court ruled that this power would in fact cause to a change in the law. There would be a change in the law if this was to take place, and only Parliament, okay, can allow for changes in the law. Therefore, it needed parliamentary approval. The more controversial case, okay, is that of Miller 2. Miller 2, which was in 2019, okay, and this was a case which I'm going to link down here. So we've got two cases. Oh, no, I'm not going to send you that because that's way too many pages. So this is the Miller 2 Supreme Court page, and Miller 2 was with regard to whether or not the government had acted unlawfully in the proroguing of Parliament. So Parliament was prorogued, and the sort of the implicit reason for why the government wants to prorogue Parliament for so long was in the fact that it would hamper the amount of time that they could debate Brexit and the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson had secured. And the question was that legal? Was that a lawful thing to do? And the Supreme Court ruled that it was not. Okay, so the proroguing of power, Parliament, proroguing, I can't even spell, proroguing, oh my gosh, my mind's gone blank, proroguing of Parliament, okay, of Parliament was unlawful. Okay, so the proroguing of Parliament was unlawful, and we're going to also link in the chat the judgment being read out. So prorogation ruling. I remember it was the whole thing was live streamed and all sorts of stuff. So the prorogation of Parliament. That is one of the ways in which we could see judicial review take place. Okay, and we've also got the case of the closure of the Lewisham Hospital as well. Yes, that was you're also correct there too. So we've got this bit of evidence here when we're talking about the power of judicial review. What other points can we have on this side of the debate? Okay, in which judges check the powers of the government and or Parliament. What kind of other checks can we think about? So we've done judicial review, we've looked at judicial review, we've given some evidence. The question is now, what is another point you would use in an essay? If nobody's got a point, we can talk about the Human Rights Act. Okay, we could talk about the impact of the Human Rights Act. Impact of the Human Rights Act. So, what does the Human Rights Act do, and why does this constitute a check by the judiciary on the executive and parliamentary and legislative branches of government? So, the Human Rights Act doesn't necessarily do anything, revolutionary in what it does. It simply prescribes the human rights provisions that were established by the European Convention of Human Rights and incorporates them into UK law. That's all really the Human Rights Act does. Before the Human Rights Act, if you wanted to bring a case to the ECTHR, the European Court of Human Rights, you'd have to go to Strasbourg and argue your case there. But under the Human Rights Act, okay, we find that we can do that within UK courts, and the judges and the judiciary can strike down. So judges can strike down actions. Okay. Strike down actions strike down actions which are incompatible. I was just reading chat at the same time, and my mind, I can't do two things at once. So, which are incompatible. Okay, so questions here. Could you do something similar for 1H or history? Yes. So tomorrow's stream is going to be on history. The poll we did the vote on which history modules we wanted to look at. It was actually a ridiculously close vote, and I was worried that that I'd have to, it would be difficult. But what we're going to do is we're going to do a Tudors question, and we're also going to do a Russia question. And the Russia question is going to be a question that is applicable to both the Tsarist and Communist Russia module and the Revolution and Dictatorship module. So, and the two questions that we're going to look at tomorrow are already on the page. So if you want to have a look at them, that's tomorrow at the same time. Anyway, back to judges striking down actions which are incompatible. Now, there are loads and loads and loads of cases with regard to human rights, okay, that where judges have struck down actions by government, exactly, various terrorism acts, terrorism acts in 2000, and obviously you're going to get points for good evidence as well, but you also get points for more obscure evidence. Okay, so I'm going to give you a piece of case law that really shows the power of the judiciary over the courts. Sorry, the power of the judiciary over the government when it comes to indefinite detention, when it comes to terrorism, because terrorism is the biggest challenge that the government has faced and the judges have faced when it comes to the Human Rights Act, the sort of clashing that they had following 9/11 because of terrorism legislation. So we've got A and Ors, and the Secretary of State, so Secretary of State for the Home Department. This is a case. So this is a case. Okay, and this was a case that was in 2005. Right. So it's pronounced A&Ors and Secretary of State for Home Department. We're not in America. In America, it would be A&Ors versus Secretary of State. But for some reason, in this country, law is and instead of or versus. Okay. Now, according to, in this case, I'm going to read the facts of the case, and then we're going to talk about the judgment. Okay, and then we're going to talk about how this is a check on government and executive and legislative power. So, the claimants were detained under Section 22 and 23 of the Act was called the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act. So the claimants, so A&Ors, were detained under the Anti-Terrorism, let me just get the abbreviation right, Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act. So Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001. Okay. When it comes to writing this down in an essay, what's best is that you spend as little time as possible reciting the facts of the case and more time going over the judgment and why this is significant for what your essay is. Okay, but the claimants were detained under the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act. They claimed that a derogation order was flawed because there was not a public emergency. Okay, so their detainment was unlawful. And the House of Lords, so they claimed, let's just say this, so they claimed their detention was unlawful, okay, because there wasn't a public emergency. Because there was not a public emergency. Was not a public emergency. Okay. So I'm simplifying this because we're not human rights lawyers. We're not doing human rights law, but this is touching into human rights law, of course, because we're talking about the relationship between the judges and legislature and the executive. So they were detained under this Act of Parliament. Okay, they claimed that this detention was unlawful because there was not a public emergency, which was something that was required. Okay. This was required under the Human Rights Act, which is Article 5 and 14. Now, the House of Lords at the time, because this is the House of Lords case, because this is 2005, this isn't the Supreme Court, the Law Lords held that this was unlawful. Okay, so this was unlawful. This was unlawful. Okay. And it was incompatible with Articles 5 and Articles 14 of the Human Rights Act. So incompatible with Articles 5 plus 14 of the Human Rights Act. Okay, so that is really as little as you need to know when it comes to the cases. So if you wanted to write this as evidence in an exam scenario, an exam question, you'd get a lot of points. Okay, you get a lot of credit for this because you are citing a specific case. Okay, where the Human Rights Act was deemed to be incompatible with the order to detain these two claimants. Okay, and so therefore the judiciary was able to check the executive and the legislative branches. Now, what I'm going to do is, before we talk about the third point, I want to move on to the other side of the debate. Okay, because while this case is a very good example of checking the powers of the legislature and the executive, why might it be problematic? Okay, why might it be something that where the Parliament specifically has the power to overrule this kind of decisions? Okay, why is the Human Rights Act not quite as powerful as, for example, the US Bill of Rights? So let's move on to the other side of the debate and talk about how we could counter this argument. Okay. What was the outcome? I've told the outcome. It was the case was ruled to be unlawful. So it was incompatible with Articles 5 and 14 of the Human Rights Act. And yes, because Parliament is sovereign. So whenever we talk about the checks that the judges have over the legislature specifically, we're always going to be overcome by this problem where parliamentary sovereignty exists. Okay, so we're always going to have parliamentary sovereignty being a problem. Okay, because as we know, the judges will work within the framework that is established by Parliament. Okay, the Human Rights Act is something that was established by Parliament. It was an act of Parliament, and so just as well, so Parliament is sovereign to make and unmake any laws. So Parliament can make and unmake any laws that they pass. This is problematic because another principle of Parliament is that a Parliament cannot bind its successor. So Parliament cannot bind its successor. So the problem here is, if one day there is enough majority support in the House of Commons and the House of Lords to repeal the Human Rights Act, to just get rid of the Human Rights Act, then Parliament has the sovereignty to do that. Parliament can do whatever it wants. Okay. So the problem there is the judges can only work within the framework of parliamentary legislation. So sovereignty is always going to be a problem when it comes to this kind of issue, and the same for the government as well. So a judge can strike down. So for example, a judge can strike down government decisions. So let's just say government decisions. However, the government can get around this problem by simply passing parliamentary legislation. So the government could just pass an act of Parliament. Pass an act of Parliament. Okay, so I think whenever we're looking at this question that we've got here, okay, it's almost expected that you're going to have to talk about parliamentary sovereignty. That is one thing that is pretty expected of you to do. Okay. So judges can rule against the government, but can't the government just ignore the decision? Well, it's a little bit more complicated. Okay. So technically no, because within the political system, the idea that the government would just ignore a decision by the Supreme Court, okay, would be very politically contentious. And this sort of dates back a little bit to what A.V. Dicey suggests, where there's a difference between what we would call legal sovereignty and political sovereignty. Now, what's important is that the government and parliament are two distinct different things as well. Okay, that's why it says in this question, executive and the legislature. Parliament could just as easily overturn any decision that a judge makes, that a Supreme Court or a High Court would make. So, for example, in this human rights case, where it was the government, okay, that was seen to be unlawful in this case, it was the Home Department, there was the Home Office. With government support, they could have just passed an act of Parliament that would override this thing here, or repeal the Human Rights Act. That's another point. They could have just repealed the Human Rights Act if they ever wanted to. So this is the problem with parliamentary sovereignty. This is the problem that the judiciary will always have, is that Parliament is technically always sovereign. Okay. So let's talk about another point that you could raise on this side of the debate. Okay. And you could go back and forth with this point as well. You could technically still talk about EU membership and the European Union, because we've only just left the European Union. So EU law and the supremacy of EU law is still something that has it still has important factors to this day. Okay, so for example, we're going to talk about how EU membership, okay, allowed for the direct effect. Notice I'm using the past tense as well. Don't forget that. Of EU law in UK courts. Okay. So a way in which the judiciary, to an extent, could have checked and has had the power to check the government and the parliament is through the application of EU law. Okay, so the European Union would, make its own laws and make its own regulations and rules. Okay, and if an act of Parliament or an act of the government was incompatible with this EU law, the UK courts could exercise EU law within the UK courts. Now, is there an example of a very, very, very famous case that you should know about, okay, where this happened, where it was decided that the EU law was, had authority within the UK court system? And don't worry, we are going to talk about Brexit, because obviously Brexit is obviously a huge thing to talk about in this case. So let me find it. Can anybody think of a case that really established this kind of principle? It's all right if you can't. It's not a big deal. Okay, so let's talk about the factor tame case. So we've got the factor tame case. I'm not going to go through the the legal facts of the case, because it's a little bit more complicated than the human rights kind of examples. Okay, but basically the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, established a precedent that UK courts can suspend UK statute law where it appears to violate EU law. Okay, ECJ can suspend UK statute law where it violates EU law. So obviously this is a very, very, very big example, a very big example of judges being able to check the power of the government and the Parliament as well. Okay. Now, the European Court of Justice can do this, and the Supreme Court also would have the kind of effect to do this, because EU law can be there is a principle of direct effect whereabouts EU law can be applied within the UK court's judiciary system. However, obviously, we all know what the counterpoint to this would be, and that is that while this has been the case for for a very long time, we now have a situation where we have left the European Union. So the extent to which we have taken back control, okay, the extent to which Parliament has taken back control is something that we should bring up as well. So when it comes to this question, you have really a lot of things you can talk about. There are lots of really interesting points you can make. Okay, I think any question like this, to what extent can judges check the power of the executive and the legislature, I think you should probably come down on quite a balanced side. Okay, you can always talk about judicial review. You can always talk about the fact that judges can prescribe that public authorities, like the government and Parliament, acted beyond their power. Okay, you can always talk about human rights and the impact that Human Rights Act has. Okay, and you could even still talk about the impact of EU membership and things like the factor tame case. But then on the other hand, okay, whenever you are talking about for and against, it does look like it's a lot less balanced than it really is. But whenever we're talking about for and against, you always can talk about parliamentary sovereignty, and you can obviously talk about Brexit. Are there any other points that we can bring up before we finish? Because we're right on time on this question, and we move on to the second question. Any other points on this side of the debate? We've got loads of points on the other side. Let's talk about this side. I'm also going to link some points, some other articles and stuff in the chat box with relation to the factor tame case. Oopsie daisy, we've run out of time. But any other points before we move on? Constitutional Reform Act. Okay. So, Donnie, to what extent? How would you apply the Constitutional Reform Act to this kind of question? What would you say about it? I need a bit more than than just naming the act. So this is a point for factor tame. Before we move on, of course, you could make the point that parliamentary sovereignty is really the trump card when it comes to the power of the judiciary over Parliament. Okay, Parliament is always sovereign, and you can apply this quite evenly. No? Okay. Right. Okay. So whilst you're talking about the Constitutional Reform Act, I'll respond to that when if you come up with a kind of way in which you can incorporate that into the essay. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a new page. That is giving the judiciary clarity in its role relationship with government. Yeah, you could make a case for the Constitutional Reform Act. Okay, because the Constitutional Reform Act did a number of very interesting things. Obviously, it enhanced, it also changed the role that the what's his name, the Chancellor, the judiciary, what was the name of the guy who was in all three branches of governments? It changed the role of the Lord Chancellor, I believe his name was. I need to check that. Hang on. But it also, yes, separated the court system out, and it did give some kind of clarity when it came to the relationship between the two branches. But you should always remember that even the Constitutional Reform Act is an act of Parliament that is sort of operating within the parliamentary process. So that's the only problem, because Parliament is still always sovereign. So I need to find the name of that person, because that will annoy me. That will. The name of the person. Hang on. Before we move on to the second question, there we go. Constitutional Reform Act. Where is it? Constitutional Reform Act. I should go back on my own videos, really. Judiciary, Newspaper Court. Yes, Lord Chancellor. His name was the Lord Chancellor. They changed the role of the Lord Chancellor because originally the Lord Chancellor was somebody who had power, quite extensive political power within all three branches of government, which is obviously quite against the, it goes quite a lot against the separation of powers, the principle of the separation of powers. Okay, let's have a look at the next question before we finish. Let's do another half an hour on this. So, to what extent does Congress have a meaningful foreign policy role? Okay, so we're going to go to a US politics question, because we did a UK politics question just then. We did 2 UK politics questions and a political ideas question last week. We haven't really touched on America at all, which we really should do, because I'm in the process of teaching the American topics at the moment. Right. So, to what extent does Congress have a meaningful foreign policy role? Now, this is quite a difficult question. This is arguably more difficult than the question before. Okay. So, let's talk about this question. So, again, it's a to what extent question. So, if we just zoom in a little bit. It's a to what extent kind of question. So we're going to be talking about a balanced argument on one hand and a balanced argument on the other hand. And it is a lot more balanced actually this time. So to what extent do they have a meaningful foreign policy role? Let's have a look on the first side of the argument. That is they... Well, that's not a very nice colour on white, is it? Let's change the colour. Let's just go for black. Okay. That is, they do. So they do have a strong foreign policy role. Now, how might you go about arguing that Congress has a very meaningful foreign policy role? Okay. It's not an easy question. It's not an easy one to really, get into. Is there any takers? There is actually a lot you can talk about. We'll go through and you'll see that there's actually quite a significant amount of things to talk about. If there's nobody that can start us off, I will begin, of course. So, okay. Let's talk about the Constitution. Okay, so the U.S. Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution has the power to veto presidential policy. Yes, that is a good point. Okay, we're going to come on to the power of the veto. Okay, and the relationship with the president. Originally, like generally speaking, people assume that the majority of foreign policy power sits with the president. He's the commander in chief. Okay, but the Constitution does actually set out a role for Congress within foreign policy. So you can talk about Article 1 of the Constitution. Of course, let's talk about the Constitution. Let's start with the Constitution. So, the Constitution. What kind of foreign policy powers do we have? Has to approve any treaty signed by the president. Yes. So the first point. So let's do number 1. The Senate approves treaties. Approves treaties. What else does the Senate do when it comes to foreign policy within the Constitution? What else can they do? Specifically the Senate. Okay. We'll talk about Congress as a whole in a minute. We'll talk about the Senate specifically in the Constitution. So they have the power to approve treaties. Okay, they can only be approved through this system. But what about other things they have to do? I say approve treaties. Let's be a little bit more legally. Let's be a little bit more precise. Ratify. Okay. Because within treaty law, you have signatory, and then you have to ratify a treaty. So another thing they can do: the Senate confirms ambassadors. Confirms ambassadors. Okay, confirms ambassadors. Congress also. Okay, so that's just the Senate. Okay, so let's have a look at what Congress also does in general. The big point I've just seen here is approve war. Yes, this is incredibly important, okay? Declarations of war. Declarations of war. If you want to formally declare war as the United States, then you have to do so within the framework of Congress. Congress has the power to declare war, okay? They also have the power. This is all in the Constitution. Okay. They also have the power to. Diplomats need to get Senate's approval. Yes. Confirms ambassadors. I'll put let's put diplomats on making treaties. Yes. So when it comes to the power of Congress, when it comes to treaty law, okay, we have so the president has the power to sign and create treaties, okay, and it's the Senate that ratifies the treaties, that brings the treaties comes into power. They also have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Okay, so we have the regulation of commerce. Now, as a side note, why do you think that this is a power of Congress and not a power of the president? This is just a little side question. Why might this be the case? And think back to the sort of reasoning of the founding fathers. Okay, think about the reasoning of the founding fathers when it comes to this. Why might the sort of regulation of commerce be something that Congress has to do? It's a very interesting question. Evie, yes. However, Congress has only declared war 11 times. We'll come on to that in a minute, because you've got the declaration of war, but at the same time, there's been wars. The last time the last time Congress formally declared war was in 1941, and there have been wars. Definitely have been wars since then. So what's the deal there? Can anyone really think why Congress? It's the power of Congress to regulate commerce with other nations internationally. Okay, why might that be the case? What might be the reasoning that the founding fathers had in making sure that be the case? It ties into the House of Representatives' power to power of the purse. What's the reasoning? Limit the power of president? Not quite. There's a more specific reason. Commercial transactions, okay, very similarly relate to the power of control over money. So control over finance, okay. So control over financial decisions, okay. Why was the House of Representatives specifically given the power to regulate money? Because they were directly elected by the people. It was the reasoning of the founding fathers that if we are going to it should be the institution that is elected by the people, okay, it's that institution that should have the power to regulate the commercial interest and the money, okay, of the people that that they are chosen to represent. That's why the House of Representatives has the power of the purse, okay. That's why financial legislation, money bills can only be started in the House of Representatives before they get to the Senate, because originally the president was elected by the Electoral College. It still is, but it's now more directly democratic, okay. And also we have the issue of the Senate not being elected at all for interstate reasons. Yes, as well, for interstate reasons too. So that's why we have this regulation of commerce. That was just a general side question. Whenever you're talking about the Constitution, okay, and and listing, say, powers of the Constitution, it's always really interesting to note why that is the case. Think about the reasoning that the founding fathers had when they were creating this Constitution. So these are the constitutional powers that Congress has, okay. But we can go beyond the constitutional powers, okay. We can also, tying into this regulation of commerce, why might the power of the purse, okay, so why might the power of the purse be a significant foreign policy role, or any kind of meaningful foreign policy role? What might Congress be able to do if they can control the money and the financial obligations of various institutions? This relates a little bit to what I was talking about when we're talking about the founding fathers. Any takers? I told you this is a tricky question. No? Okay. Let me explain. With Congress having the power to control finance, they can control financing, so they control the financing of foreign endeavors, foreign endeavors, e.g. armed forces. Okay. So this is a meaningful foreign policy role. They have the role of funding any of the president's foreign policy decisions. Okay, and we're going to talk about why this is not necessarily all that effective when we go on to the other side of the debate. And we're going to use the example of Iraq in 2006 to 2008. Sorry, I forgot about the Iraq War for a second for some reason. Okay, but it's still a meaningful reason. Okay, the way in which the U.S. Constitution is established and the way in which the power of the people's money is established and distributed through the system gives Congress a sort of implicit, meaningful financing role. Okay, now let's talk about. Okay. Have any of you thought about the concept of alternate foreign policy? So Congress has the power to Alternative foreign policy. What might I mean if we're talking about alternative foreign policy? Let's have a look. Let's see if anybody's got any interesting points whilst I list some. Yeah, I could use this. What can I mean by alternative foreign policy? If nobody has any idea, I'll explain it very quickly. So, there have been examples and there has been evidence of Congress, okay, acting in a way in which they have alternative foreign policy to the president. So different foreign policy to the president. And I can give you two specific examples. Okay, I'll give you two specific examples. We have the policies. Sort of effectively. So you can have, when you have a president and a Congress that sort of act that are sort of the different parties. There's obviously a lot of clash between the two. And when it comes to foreign policy decisions, Congress could just decide to, pass legislation or go and do political trips or something that is completely alternative to the foreign policy decisions that the president has, which gives them a meaningful foreign policy role. And I'm going to give you two examples of where this has been the case. Okay, we've got the passing by Congress of the Helms-Burton Act. Okay, and what the Helms-Burton Act is, and this was passed under Bill Clinton. So under Bill Clinton, what this did was it strengthened and continued a U.S. embargo against Cuba. Okay, so that's all you really need to know about what the Helms-Burton Act even did. So strengthens plus it continues U.S. embargo against Cuba. Now this isn't necessarily against directly contradictory of the president's foreign policy decisions, but it's something that a foreign policy decision that Congress sort of acted on their own. Okay, with the Helms-Burton Act. We've got an even stronger case for this, and this is the trip to Syria that was done in 2007 by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. So 2007 trip to Syria by House Speaker, then House Speaker, and today House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Now, Nancy Pelosi was heavily criticised for her trip to Syria because it went almost against the foreign policy decision of the president at the time, who was George W. Bush. I'm going to link an article in the thingy here. And the Helms-Burton Act is also something that sort of ran almost contradictory to foreign policy decisions that were made under the Clinton administration. Now, the extent to which Congress can pass legislation that that contradicts the wishes of the president is limited because of the president's power to veto any legislation that he so chooses. So you got the president's veto. So the president's veto power. But obviously, if there's enough bipartisan support within Congress, they could overturn that with a 2/3 majority. So these are 3 points here. Okay, you could talk about other points. You could talk about the congressional power to declare war being reinforced by the War Powers Act. But let's start looking at the other side of the debate. Okay, let's start looking at the other side of the aisle. Okay, why does Congress not have a meaningful foreign policy role? Why might they not have a meaningful foreign policy role? This is the last section. Oh, we're actually exactly on time as well. That's brilliant. Okay. Okay, dokie. Just write a note for myself as well, just so I can remember. Power. Okay. Right. Well, obviously, the first point we can talk about is a point that was brought up earlier by Evie about the power to declare war. Okay. The last time that Congress formally declared war, so the last formal declaration of war, okay, last formal declaration of war was in 1941. So my question is, why is that the case? Why is it that we've had that, you know, the US has been involved in numerous wars since World War II, since 1941, but it hasn't been through the formal declaration of war done by Congress? Why is that the case? And we've got it straight away. So the president is commander-in-chief. So the president is commander-in-chief. Easy question. So president is commander-in-chief. Commander-in-chief. And this gives the president very broad powers when it comes to military action abroad. Okay, and that obviously links to foreign policy decisions. And you can talk about examples. You can just list as many examples of as you want of wars that have taken place without congressional approval. So we could talk about Korea, we could talk about Vietnam, we could talk about Iraq. But what's more powerful, as Dominic has just mentioned down here, okay, is you can talk about conflicts and military action that takes place at the express denial of Congress, where Congress says no, effectively. And this is, we can talk about the 2011 attack on Libya. Attack on Libya. So we've got the attack on Libya. Okay, we've also got the attacks on Syria. So attacks on Syria. I mean, you could even go as far as February 2021. Seems as it was only last week that the Biden administration launched an airstrike on Libya. You could also talk about even the express without congressional approval at all. So with express. What's the word I'm going to use? So with no approval. Let's just say with no approval whatsoever. And we can talk about the 1999 attack on Kosovo. 1999 on Kosovo. Okay. So these are all very, very clearly broad foreign policy powers that the president has that Congress has had effectively no power to stop. So Congress, had no formal approval through formal declaration of war in places like Vietnam, in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. How can what happen, Dom? How can what happen? And then when it comes to And then when it comes to more recent times, we've got the 2011 attack on Libya. We've got the attacks on Syria that are still going to this day, as late as last week. We've had an airstrike on Syria, and we have, with no approval, the attack of the in 1999 on Kosovo. So Kosovo is one that U.S. strikes on Kosovo. And of course, this relates to the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia when it comes to the Kosovo War. Okay, so that goes into a little bit more detail about something else. So let's just talk. There's an article here about the NATO bombings in Yugoslavia. How can a president go to war without consent of the legislature? They do it through their implied power as commander-in-chief. Okay, as commander-in-chief, it's quite vague. Okay, and they go to war through, effectively arguing that what they're doing isn't a war; it's military action, or it's a specific strike on military targets. And because war is a very specific term. I mean, in law, it's is a specific. It has a specific legal implications. The context, suggesting that that the president can suggest that they are just launching strikes or preemptive strikes on a target, and that can constitute what we would call, colloquially, that would constitute a war or an armed conflict. But in reality, legally within the framework of the Constitution, it might not be. Okay, which is very interesting. Let's talk about another point. We can talk about the this alternative foreign policy that we have here. Effectively, any foreign policy legislation, okay, passed by Congress, can be vetoed. Any legislation passed by Congress can be vetoed, but specifically as well foreign policy. So when it comes to the context of foreign policy, and of course overriding a veto requires a 2/3 majority. So the veto override requires a 2/3 majority. So to what extent does Congress have significant or meaningful foreign policy role? Well, when it comes to the passing of legislation, any kind of legislation that is passed requires presidential approval, and this is of course true as well for foreign policy legislation, and so therefore it requires the implied consent of the president. That's how you could argue this point. And there is one more point I want to argue as well before we finish up, okay, and this is the controlling of the financing section. Okay, so I mentioned in earlier that the control of finance is something that is something that Congress has a power over when it comes to financial controls. Okay, however, in reality, the congressional power to control the purse, often doesn't end well. So often doesn't end well. And we can talk about Iraq. Okay, so I'm going to find some let's find an article about this. Power of the purse. Okay, United States. Okay. So more recently, budget limitations on using the power of the purse formed a controversial part of discussion regarding congressional opposition to the Iraq War. On March the 23rd, 2007, the US House of Representatives passed a supplemental war budget that imposed a timeline on the presence of the American combat troops, but the legislation was not passed. Okay, so in 2007, the House proposed legislation, okay, limiting finance in order to basically put a time frame on the war in Iraq. Okay, so if it's seen that that the conflict in Iraq has gone on too long, which it had done, sorry, then they could pass a bill, okay, a war budget that would limit the amount of money, so there's the amount of money that they could even spend, to try and limit the amount of time that they're spending in Iraq. Okay, limiting finance in order to set a timeline for Iraqi leaving Iraq. Okay. Now, in reality, this didn't work. Okay, because this didn't get passed. Okay, did not work. This did not work. So you could talk about the fact that the congressional power of the purse, okay, isn't necessarily very useful, because when it comes to controlling foreign policy, because when it comes to examples like Iraq, when we're talking about the 2007 bill, it didn't pass, so they had no power in that regard. So in reality, this question is actually a lot more detailed than we might think. There's a lot more that we could really go at and talk about. Okay, so you've got power not. Can you use the example of Obama and his use of drone strikes in the Middle East? Yes, you can use Obama's drone strikes. That would fit into this bit here. Okay, so the power of the president to use his powers as commander-in-chief to administer drone strikes over a number of different places and people in the Middle East. You could also talk about the assassination of bin Laden and the assassination of al-Baghdadi under Trump and Obama. Okay, I assume you mean 2008 or beyond, because Obama wasn't in office in 2000, but I assume that was just a correction. So these are the kind of foreign policy powers we can talk about. Ultimately, though, I think if I was gonna, someone put a gun to my head and told me how would you decide one way or the other on this, I'd probably lean more towards this side of the debate. That the power of foreign policy is more heavily vested in the office of the presidency. But there are some constraints to that, and there are some ways in which it could be the other way around. Okay, so we've actually finished in exactly the right time, which I'm very happy with. Tomorrow I'm going to do a stream on history for A level. We're going to talk about a question for the Tudors. I'm going to talk about a question for Russia, because the poll was very close when it came to the two Russian modules that are taught, which are Tsarist and Communist Russia and Revolution and Dictatorship. What I'm going to do is I've got a question. I'll put a question up that is that can cover both topics, which is very interesting. So we're going to talk about both of those tomorrow at the same time at 1, and it's going to take about an hour as well. And then we'll do this again next week with more questions. I might put a poll up if anybody wants specific types of questions. So I hope everybody has enjoyed this. If there are any more questions, let me know now. And then if not, for those who are doing history, I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll finish here, effectively. So if there are any more questions, I'll let the stream catch up. So, any more questions? If not, If not, then I'll go now. Okay. I'm also going to try and sort this. Oh, there we go. That's the timer. I'm also going to try and sort this latency problem, because I don't like that it's like 10 seconds behind. That's annoying. If not, okay, right. Well, if there is any, put them in the comments down below when this becomes an actual video. I shall see you all very, very soon.